Hello, everybody. Oh, I'm loud. Hello. My name's Jai Jordan. I'm a tech consultant lead at Make Positive, and I'm here today to talk to you about source-driven configuration and moving away from change sets and onto Salesforce developer experience. Don't worry, this is an admin talk, but the tool is called developer experience. So there's many advantages to using SalesforceDX over change sets, and we're going to touch on those today. Let's see if this works. Yes, cool. Okay. So we're going to touch on, we'll touch on the classic approach, which is using change sets, SalesforceDX tools. We'll have a quick demo. We'll talk about source control, so that's how you can take all your configuration and track it. And and then we'll look at some extra reading to sort of take you on from this adventure. Cool. So I'm sure the majority of the audience is aware of change sets, but in case there's any business users, or just to sort of drill over them, we'll talk about change sets quickly. So change sets are built in sandboxes, and they have a built-in audit trail. But you have to manually add all of your changes in. So let's say you create a couple of fields with different first letters or different objects, things like that. You have to sort of manually go in, find all those fields. It's quite a cumbersome process. And you can only release between the same flow. So if you have a production org, you create your sandboxes from there. You can only deploy from those sandboxes to your production org. You can't have like a separate development environment that you build things in and then to release them all across. And it's quite a cumbersome process, like I said. So this is how I see how you would use change sets if you were going to use change sets. So I'm just going to quickly touch on this. So first of all, you'd have one master change set for your projects that contains everything you've built, everything you worked on, all your different stories and so on. And you would validate that. So you deploy it as an outbound change set to a CI sandbox. CI stands for continuous integration, but don't worry about that. Effectively, what it means is it's a carbon copy of production. You've created a sandbox from production, and you don't deploy anything to it. You just deploy an outbound change set to that, and then as an inbound change set, you validate it against the org. That's just to make sure that your change set will always deploy to production. Then, assuming that goes well, you go to your QA sandbox. Oh, sorry, just on the previous topic. The reason you use a separate sandbox rather than production org is so that you don't lock your production instance and affect the performance of that, and also so you don't have to give access to admins for everyone in production. So you deploy to a QA sandbox, effectively follow the flow. You do any testing there against your acceptance criteria, and if there's any issues, you go back, fix them in the config sandbox, go through the process again, come to here. Eventually, you go to your full sandbox, which is where you do user acceptance testing with real data. And eventually, you go to prod. And then if there's any issues, you would then use a hotfix sandbox or a new release, depending on the scale of the issue and severity. That's how you use change sets, right? So let's look at SalesforceDX. SalesforceDX is a little different. First of all, let's think about what the source of truth is. So first of all, what's the source of truth? So let's say that you've got a recipe, and you're making a soup or a stew, right? And you've got all your ingredients in, and then you've followed it to the recipe, to the note, and you taste it and you think, this needs a bit of salt or a bit of pepper or some extra spices. You add those spices in. Suddenly, you've changed the source of truth. It's no longer the recipe, it's your stew. So as soon as you've eaten that stew, how do you make that stew again? You can follow the recipe, and it will never be the same, right? So what do you do? How do you make the recipe the source of truth again? You just get a pen and you add on the recipe, add these spices in. Suddenly the recipe is the source of truth again. So in Salesforce, the source of truth historically was always your sandbox environment, your production environment. It was never actually the things that you're building. And so if I went in and changed something in production after you've released it, suddenly what I've changed is now your source of truth, which is not good to say the least, right? So SalesforceDX is a little bit of a different approach. It's all driven around the source of truth being exportable. So if you configure some fields and validation rules, process bullet flows, they don't sit in Salesforce. They sit in a version control system, and what sits in Salesforce is just the release of those. So everything is always mastered in one place in the version control system. It gives you some options for things like rollback. So say that I built something, and then I add something else on top of it, and I realize that actually that's broken something else. I can just easily roll back to the previous version. And we're going to look at something called scratch orgs a little bit later, which is the alternative to sandboxes that you use with SalesforceDX, and why these are much faster than change sets. And you'll see later on why that is. So, classic orgs. With a classic org model, you have a sandbox, which is great for production. Production is like the recipe, as opposed to source control. And so you have your sandbox, and you need to release for a change set. Scratch orgs, on the other hand, the disposable Salesforce orgs, they're not sandboxes. These are developer orgs with a twist. So they're completely isolated from your production org. And what happens is you have this thing called a devpub in your production org or in your developer org. I recommend you try this first with a developer org. Don't do it in your production org for your company, right? And you create these scratch orgs from it. So they sort of follow a recipe. And when you first create one, you won't have a recipe for one, right? Because you have nothing in source control. So it will effectively be an empty org. And then what you'll do is you'll configure some stuff in there, create some fields, validation rules, workflow rules, email templates, etc. And when you're done, you'll run one command, and everything you've built will get exported right down to your system. No fiddling about with change sets, trying to make sure, have I got that validation, or have I got that workflow? And then you try and deploy it, and it's not there, you missed something. So it's great. It does a lot of the work for you. You can easily log in to them. That might not sound like a big deal, but it is pretty useful. So let's look at those. So let's see if I can swipe the right way. So in this scenario, I've set up a developer org. This is a devpub org from the dev trial org. So it creates the developer org for you, and it turns on developer hub. But if you were to go into an org which doesn't have developer hub enabled, you go into quick find and setup, and you search for dev hub, and then never works the first time you click, does it? Yeah. And then it would already be enabled here, but if not, you'd have to enable it yourself. So that's once you've done that, you've got your dev hub turned on. So now you can create scratch orgs. So what do? You go and you install the Salesforce command line interface tools. So you download them, install them. It takes a little bit longer than this in practice, but I've cut out a couple of frames in the video, so as soon as password's in, it's installed. Okay. And then what you do is you open up a terminal on your Mac, or you open up your shell, your little Windows shell on Windows. It sounds scary. It's really not. There's a couple of commands you run. I've got them sort of covered in here, and also some documentation linked at the end. So the first thing you do is you type in SFDX to check it's installed correctly. SFDX is just the command line name for the SalesforceDX command line interface. And then to set up the developer org, the devpub org, you do force auth web login. Then you type in D for devpub and A for an alias. This is where you give it a name, and you say, OK, this is the devpub. Okay? Hit enter. And what it will do is it'll give you a login screen. You put in your credentials. Should have cut that bit. Put in your credentials. You hit login. And then he cycles for no time. And now, if you go back to the terminal, it will say it's been set up. You can close the browser. So as soon as we close that tab, we now have a developer hub org. We can now create our first scratch org. And you can just see this folder here is the folder that I've set up for this. So we're going to navigate to this folder. And in my case, I've created it in my home folder, a folder called get, and then SalesforceDX-admins. So now we're in the same folder as that. So we're going to run a command, and what this command does is it creates a scratch org. So again, it starts with force. In this case, it's project, create, and this will create a scratch org. So we put in, sorry, this will create the project locally first, sorry. So we put the name of this, and we're going to call it, it's a test, you can ignore it. So we call it admins.
May I have your attention, please?
And on the left-hand side here, it's created a folder called admins, and it's created a couple of things.
Signal will first sound, followed by the fire evacuation signal. Please take no further action.
So it's created. So you can see this is sort of like the boilerplate folder structure, and it's got nothing in it because we haven't got any config yet. So now, see the port video is also conveniently paused. So now we're in this admins folder.
Hearing messages or fire alarm signals, provide main reception. Thank you for your cooperation.
Yeah, so now we're in this admins folder. CD just means change directory. So we're in this folder here. You can see the admins folder we've got on the left-hand side. And we're typing another force command. So again, it starts force. It's force org create. So this is going to create our scratch org. And we'll just give it a name. S is for scratch org. We'll just give it a name. I think I might have called it. That's the name of the folder. Maybe I didn't give it a name. Yeah. And that's the name of the definition file, which is on the top left. We just got a boilerplate one, which is the out of the box one, so I need to change it. Then give it a name of scratch org. Hit enter. Anytime. So what this does is this creates your scratch org, which is your disposable developer org, which has got a twist. So obviously we're at the mercy of Salesforce to create this, but it shouldn't take very long because it's an empty one. So once this org's created, yep, now we can log into this org. And the way that we log into this org is we type in SalesforceDX force org open. And because it's the context of the folder in, it will just open up our org. So there you go. This is what I mean by easy login. You logged into the scratch org. Cool. Learning experience. Einstein cycling. OK. So now, this is our scratch org. So everything in this org is automatically tracked by Salesforce, all the changes we make. Kind of like an audit trail, but a little bit better than that. So we'll just go in. I'll just show you the company information. It is a developer org with a twist. Developer edition. There you go. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a custom object. And the custom object is going to be animal, because I've got no imagination. So these are just animals, and I think animal name's fine. Yeah. So we go through the process, we create a custom object, then we create a couple of custom fields on there. So we're going to create a date of birth for the animal. It's just a regular date field, just the same as you create in any org. And then we're going to create. I should have sped this up a little bit. Sorry, guys. So I effectively did this and recorded it just in case there were internet problems here. Sorry. So then we're going to create a pick list, and it'll be the species of animal. And we're going to go for dog, cat, and rabbit. All domestic animals. Okay, and then lastly what we're going to do is we're going to create a master detail relationship where the animal is a detail of contact, and that's going to be the owner of the pet animal, right? I'm just going to try and jump ahead of this because it's pretty simple. Cool. So we've created all those fields. And then we're just going to go on to the contact page layout, and we're just going to reposition the animals pick list, related list to be right at the top, because it's the most important thing about contact is their pairs. And then now that we've done that, we're going to retrieve all of the things we just configured. So this is when you see the magic, right? So Salesforce.org force source pull. And what this is going to do is it's going to look at all the changes that we've made in this scratch org, compare them with what we've got locally, which is nothing because it's a new project. But if you'd already got fields and you're updating new fields and things like that, it would only find the difference. And it's going to, it's a little hard to read on the screen of this, but basically what we've done is we've got the new custom object, which is animal. We've got these 3 custom fields we created, the layouts we changed, so the animal layout, the contact layout, and we've got these profiles here, which have been updated because we've given access to those profiles, okay? So let's just see what that looks like. So you see it's created all these different records for them, and if we just go to the file manager on the left-hand side, we've got an object, then you've got the animal folder, which is the name of the object, and you've got the fields. So each field is represented as a separate file. And if we look at these fields, you can see what these look like. So, for instance, the date of birth field is a date field there. You can just see those are all the things you set up that require, etc. It's really simple field, and then it's pretty similar for the owner and species. So owner is a master detail, so it tells you it's a master detail, and it tells you the parent is contact. And then species, because this has not got a global pick list, all the pick list values are defined inside the field. They're there. Whereas if you had a global pick list, there'd be a separate metadata type called global values that would appear as a folder here. And then for your profiles, just look at the admin profile. You've got references here to some of the things. So for instance, date of birth field is at the top of here. So that's making it readable and editable. So that's the two values. You've got your readable is the readable, and the edit is the opposite of read only on the checkbox. So that's a very basic example, but it shows you the power to just sort of magically retrieve things without having to worry about change sets, right? I think that's a wrap on this. A few seconds left, yeah. I'll just show you some of the page layouts, but it's effectively the same kind of thing. You can see the relate list and where it is and things like that. Cool. So let's just look back at what this looks like again. So these are the three fields we created. These are how they're displayed. And this is what each one looks like as XML, okay? And so what Salesforce does for you is it easily creates this data model. You can easily say, OK, each field is a field on disk. And this might not seem like anything revolutionary, but when you compare it with some of the tools that we used to have before as developers, you basically have one massive file with everything relating to the object on it. So this isolates it nicely and makes it much cleaner to read. Now, let's look at source control, OK? So here's a terrible analogy, OK? Let's imagine you're making a sandwich, and you've got this super magical refrigerator, and it's called version control, or Git, which is the version control technology, right? So first thing you do is you get your 2 slices of bread, right? And you butter those. And then you put them on a shelf in the fridge. And this fridge is a magical fridge. So what it does is it has lots of shelves in the fridge. Whenever you put something in the fridge, you can take that thing back out of the fridge, but it also stays on that shelf. So it's effectively a permanent supply of that food, right? So one shelf in your fridge now always has these 2 buttered slices of bread in it. So you put them in, and you take them out. You've still got the buttered slices of bread. Then what you do is you add some cheese, right? Because, OK, you need cheese in your sandwich. Of course you do. So then you put that on another shelf of the fridge. And now in your fridge, you've got one shelf which has the buttered bread and one shelf which has the cheese sandwich, right? Now what you do is you add your tomato, your cucumber, your lettuce, whatever you want in your sandwich, right? You put that on another shelf, OK? Then what you do is you add ketchup to your sandwich, and you put it on another shelf. And then you think, wait a second, who has ketchup in a sandwich? So what you would have done with change sets is you'd have got a knife, and you'd tried to scrape the ketchup out, but there'd have been little bits of ketchup left in your sandwich. And who wants ketchup in their sandwich, right? But with your magic version control fridge, you can just go to the previous shelf and pull out the sandwich without the ketchup in, and then you could add like mayonnaise or mustard or whatever you want, right? So that's versioning in a nutshell and rollback support, the ability to get the previous version of the sandwich. OK. So the shelves of the fridge could be treated like branching, right? Which is where you have different branches for different states of the fridge, but they can also be treated like commits. But a good way to think about branching is, let's say instead of you making the sandwich on your own, you're making the sandwich, and your wife's also making the sandwich. So you butter the bread, you put the cheese in, she gets the buttered bread, and she puts the other fillings in, right? But now you've got 2 sandwiches, and neither of them have the right fillings in them. Well, what you can do with merging is you can take the contents of those 2 shelves and compact them down into one sandwich, OK? But maybe your wife has poor taste, and she wants to put ketchup in the sandwich. So that's what a pull request is. She'd say, I want to merge my sandwich with your sandwich. And you'd say, well, I don't want ketchup in my sandwich. And then you wouldn't merge it. That's effectively what a pull request is. It's a review of the 2 branches before you merge them. That's an analogy of source control. So I've been given a 5 minutes warning sign. So we're going to struggle to go through all this. But basically, similar to the process before, you have a feature story. So you have, first we have a release branch. This is the project you're working on. Then, assuming you're using some kind of story software like Jira, or maybe you're using Trello, or some kind of marker to say what it is, you have a feature branch, which is the name of your story with the number, right? From that, you create a scratch org on demand. Now, what you saw as an example does not have anything already in the scratch org, but if you're working on a release here, all the other stories would start to build something up, which would go into your release branch, and then when you create your feature branch, so you're taking off that level of the fridge, putting on the next one, you've already got those stories in it. So those stories would then exist. The configuration for those stories would exist in your scratch org when you roll it up. Once you test that builds successfully against your CI environment, which is your test sandbox again, you would merge that into a branch, which is called deploy QA. And that exists for one purpose, which is deploying to your QA regular sandbox for doing your QA testing in. Assuming that passes, and you don't have to do rework. Rework, you go through the same process again. Assuming that passes, you merge that into a release branch. That then goes into to deploy UAT. So the release branch is merged into deploy UAT, which is deployed to your full sandbox. If this fails any user acceptance here, what you do not do is use the existing release branch. Instead, you make a release branch from that release branch because a release number is sacred, right? So you don't reuse the release number. You then make the changes in the new release branch and go through the same process. When you're ready to go to production, what you do is you compare anything that you've touched with stuff in production and make sure that you're not overwriting anyone's work. Let's say you've got some admins that love changing things in production and you haven't shown them the light. You compare that stuff and merge any of those changes in, and then you release that to production. There's some tools you can use to do this. So my personal favorite is to use SourceTree. I'm not meant to recommend products, but SourceTree is clearly the best tool if you want to have a visual way to manage source code. Yeah, and then these are lots of different Git providers. They're all good. They provide Git as a service that you can. Most of them provide it for a certain number of private repos for free, like GitHub, Bitbucket. You can have so many private repos or so many users in a private repo for free, so you can try that all out. How do you release your changes to a sandbox? So actually, the format I showed you as a source format it's not what you use to deploy to sandboxes. It's only used for scratch orgs. So what you do, I will provide these slides, by the way, over Twitter. So what you do is you basically use the source convert command, and it will take the beautiful source format and turn it into an uglier format called the metadata format, which we used to use. And then you deploy it using this sort of command here. Now, this is one way of doing it yourself, but another way of doing it is to do it with a tool that manages that for you. So there's lots of different tools you can use. Jenkins, Bitbucket Pipelines, Circle CI, one of the sponsors, I can't remember what they're called. Sorry? Yeah, Gitset, and I guess Capado would be an alternative to this kind of process. Yeah. You can use all those kind of tools as a wrap around it, so that some of those scripts and commands you don't run yourself, and also some of the commands that you saw running the terminal, you can create them as, like, say, quick actions and tools like SourceTree, so that you never actually have to really write the commands. So these are some resources that you should go through. So first of all, this quick start just tells you how to set up SalesforceDX and create a scratch org. Admin Experience is a visual tool that's an alternative to this process. You can certainly give it a look, but I recommend you learn this process. It's not as scary as it looks. This is a reference to the commands that we were using, so like force, :org, :open, things like that. This tells you how it all works and gives you examples. So it really isn't rocket science for you to read that. This is telling you how to release changes to Sandbox's prod, where you convert the format. This is to do with compressing profiles. I don't have time to go into it, but effectively profiles are a really big mess, and it fixes an issue with profiles. Questions? I think I have like a couple of minutes. Okay, hold on. I've got to repeat all your questions. Let's see. Okay, first of all, am I advocating that an admin should work in a scratch org, or that an admin should work in a sandbox and those changes should be merged in? And the second question was, if an admin was using a scratch org, would they create the scratch org, or would a developer create it for them? So in answer to the first question, I'm absolutely recommending that admins move over to scratch orgs. Yeah, it's clearly the way Salesforce is going, and it's the way things are going. The source of truth is not meant to be sandboxes anymore. Obviously, they're not forcing that on anyone yet, but I think as things progress over the years, they'll nudge you more like they do with nudge you to use Lightning Experience, ever so gently. I'm sure we've seen the gentle nudges. In regards to whether an admin should set up a scratch org or not, I think the time it comes down to security, whether your admin should have admin access in production or not, and whether you trust them to be doing that. Personally, I would, on the projects I work on as a consultant, I would let my colleagues who are admin focused create scratch orgs. Absolutely, yeah. I don't think this stuff is that scary. It might look scary when you first look at it, but it's once you get the head around it, it's really not that difficult. Any other questions? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, just to follow up on it. So you think the admin fire up a scratch org, and then they would kind of pull it down into, you have them running the command line scripts to kind of pull it into Git and push it up and all those sort of things.
So what I would do is it's not very visible. Sorry, my text size is quite small. I'm not sure how to make it bigger. Does this do anything? No. In SourceTree, which is a Git tool, one of the ones that I talked about that I recommend, you have this concept of actions and custom actions. So what I would do is I would define custom actions. This is what it's open on my other screen, sorry. See if I can drag that across. What I would do is define custom actions that do a lot of this stuff for you, so that you wouldn't expect everyone to know how to run the commands themselves. They'd run a command here which runs some of those commands. You combine things like you combine the profile compression, you combine pulling the source and creating the scratch org. So although, like I said, it's an empty scratch org there, when you're working on a project, it won't be. It will contain all the stuff that's been worked on for that release, right? And if you have managed packages and things like that, that can all be part of the script to set up and install them as part of creating the scratch org. Obviously, it does increase the time to create the org, but it does with anything. Installing packages takes time. Any questions? Anyone have no idea what I've talked about? Sorry, my pacing was a little off, so I had to rush the second half. If anyone's got any questions that they maybe don't want to ask in front of everyone, I'm around. I can take questions or take questions outside. I can show you all things. Thanks.